it's Michael Lowe. Should I stay or should I go? If you're a man and a woman you live with is accusing you of family violence, should you stay there and wait for the police? Or should you leave before the police get there? That's the question I want to answer today. And today I'm going to tell you that if you're a man and you're being accused by a woman of family violence, more than likely you should go. And I'm going to give you my 5 reasons why I think you should go. But before we get started, there's one thing I have to warn you about. There's a high percentage chance that if you're involved in a domestic violence situation, you're going to be intoxicated, or your spouse is going to be intoxicated, or both of you are going to be intoxicated. So the decision to leave is also dependent upon whether or not you can operate a motor vehicle or safely leave on foot without getting arrested for driving while intoxicated or harming yourself in some worse way. So with that said, here are my top 5 reasons why I think you should go. The first reason why you should go is because it's safer for everybody. But before you understand why it's safer for both yourself and the person who's calling and anybody else in your home that you leave, you have to understand the situation from the perspective of the police officer. If you leave while somebody's calling 911 accusing you of assaulting them, the 911 operator is going to ask the person calling 911, is the person who assaulted you still in the home with you? And that person calling 911 about you is going to let the 911 operator know that you're not there. And the 911 operator is then going to transmit that information to the responding police officer. In 2019, the Department of Justice found that approximately 40% of all police officer fatalities took place while the police officers were responding to a domestic violence call. So from the perspective of a police officer, this is a highly volatile situation. Most police officers are going to be on edge. They're going to be ready to use a weapon against anybody who threatens them. If you're not there and the police officer knows you're not there, it's going to make the officer know that the situation is a little bit less volatile, less threatening to them, which keeps everything a lot safer for everybody. So those are the reasons why I think it's much safer for everybody involved that you leave the situation when somebody calls 911 saying that you've assaulted them. The second reason I believe you should go if somebody is accusing you of family violence and you're a man and the person accusing you is a woman is that if you stay, you're probably going to get arrested. And the reason why I say you're probably going to get arrested is based on the way police investigate these types of cases and how police are trained to investigate and handle these types of situations. From the perspective of a police officer, their 2 main concerns in a situation like this are their own personal safety, number 1, which I've already discussed. But the second concern that they have is they don't want there to be another allegation of family violence, or they don't want somebody to get killed or hurt later on. So police officers are trained to go ahead and make an arrest if they can establish some type of probable cause. Probable cause is the lowest burden of proof in the land. It's much lower than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's very easy for a police officer to establish probable cause. Police officers are trained to simply establish probable cause, and they're not really trained to consider defenses like self-defense. From the perspective of a police officer, a self-defense claim made by an accused person who remains at the scene is probably going to be considered more something that you should just go tell the judge later on after you get arrested. So the police officer will be heavily incentivized to arrest you if you stay. Now, if you leave, an at-large warrant will be issued for your arrest more than likely. However, there have been cases in the past where the at-large warrant never happened because of certain facts or circumstances that may have been brought to light to the police department before the at-large warrant can become activated. In other words, it is possible if you leave that there will never be a warrant issued for your arrest. So from that perspective, I believe that it's better that you leave. Okay, so the third reason why I believe you should leave if you're a man being accused of domestic violence, by a woman in your home is something that I've talked about a lot, and that is, I don't want you giving a statement to the police. If you give a statement to the police are going to have a body camera on them, and that body camera is going to record everything you say. And that recording is going to be given to the DA's office, and the DA's office is going to use that against you later on. So you're also going to be in a situation where you're going to be separated from the person accusing you. So when the police interview your accuser, you're not going to be able to hear what they're saying about you. So you're not going to know how to respond to the situation. And it's very common in these situations for there to be lies told to the police. So you're not going to be in an optimal situation to give a statement to the police. In fact, you're going to be at a great disadvantage. And I've done lots of other videos about this situation. And if you need more references, you can just go watch those other videos about why I believe you should never speak to the police. But the bottom line is, the third reason why I think you should go is because you shouldn't give a statement to the police. The fourth reason why I think you should go is because ultimately it's going to make it harder for the DA's office to ever prove a case against you later on in court. And before you can understand why it's going to be harder, you have to understand a very common scenario in these cases. It's very common for someone to call the police and make an accusation, but then later on when the case gets to court, change their mind and say, no, it didn't really happen like that, it happened a different way. And in those situations, you may find yourself in a situation where you want to set the case for trial. And if you decide to set the case for trial, then the person who accused you would then need to come to court to testify against you in order for the state to win their case. Well, that's going to be incumbent upon the state to bring the person who accused you to court to testify against you. But if that person doesn't want to cooperate with the DA's office, and for whatever reason the DA's office cannot subpoena that person to come to court, then somebody's going to have to come to court and at a minimum identify the defendant sitting in the courtroom, just like you see on TV. And that can be very difficult for the state to prove in certain cases. Now, 911 operators are trained to find identifying information like names or are you married and things like that when the complaining witness calls the 911 operator and makes the accusation initially. But even that information may not be sufficient for the DA's office to establish the identity of the defendant later on in court. So it could actually be a pretty decent defense on a family violence case if the state is unable to find the complaining witness and bring them to court. In other words, a defendant can say, you can't identify me because I wasn't there when the police arrived. On the other hand, if a person stays and waits for the police to show up, then their identity is no longer in question. I mean, they were there and they can be arrested and the police can easily identify them later. So that's my fourth reason. I think it's a lot harder for the DA's office in certain circumstances to prove their case if you do not remain at the scene when the police arrive. Okay, so my fifth and final reason why I think you should go is because the process of getting arrested and getting bonded out of jail and having to deal with your conditions that you'll have to comply with for bond and also any future protective order are probably going to be a little easier for you. And before we get into that, we have to first understand what normally happens when somebody gets arrested for a family violence case if they remain at the scene. Normally, if a person is charged with a misdemeanor family violence case and they're arrested at the scene, they're taken to a jail, and then the jail magistrate will almost always issue something called an emergency protective order. And the emergency protective order on a misdemeanor assault case in Texas is going to vary between 31 days and 61 days. Most of the time, it's 61 days. And the emergency protective order is going to be an order directed to the defendant that's enforceable by a violation of a Class A misdemeanor, violation of a protective order, that says that the defendant cannot return to the residence or workplace of the person who is accusing them of family violence. That's for a Class A misdemeanor. For a felony deadly weapon case, it can be up to 91 days. So it can be 61 to 91 days for an emergency protective order. So those protective orders, though, are for the most part discretionary. And in a situation where an at-large warrant may become active a week later, 2 weeks later, because you didn't stay at the scene, then the judge in the jail, the magistrate, is less likely to issue that protective order. Now, the magistrate probably still will issue the protective order, but the likelihood is much lower that that'll happen. The other reason is that in certain family violence cases, the magistrate can make a finding that immediate release of the defendant on bond could result in continued family violence. And if the magistrate has probable cause to believe that, the magistrate can put a 24-hour hold or a 48-hour hold on certain deadly weapon cases. And that hold, what does that mean? That means that the defendant has to remain in jail for that 24-hour period after they post their bond, or in a deadly weapon case, an additional 48 hours after they post their bond. And that finding has to do with immediate release likely to cause further family violence. And usually magistrates will make that finding in a situation where somebody remains at the scene and the police say that the situation was highly volatile maybe, and that the person, if they're released, could return to the scene and commit further family violence. On the other hand, if you've left the scene and a warrant becomes activated a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, it's much less likely that the magistrate will make such a finding because a lot of time has elapsed since the original allegation. So that's my fifth and final reason why I think you should go if somebody's accusing you of family violence. Thank you very much.